All right. G'day, guys, from the FTI Tribe and FFC groups. I'm Tarek, the founder director of the Functional Training Institute, and I've got Kim Peachy, who's one of our master presenters and does a lot of content production for us. You've obviously been seeing Kim do some great stuff for the past few months, and certainly she's been with us for a number of years doing some excellent presenting and educating across Australia. So we've got a fascinating topic here, Q&A, so it is interactive. And, you know, Kim's going to be the geek on this, and I'll chime in from time. So this one is Programming Progressions 101 for the general populations. And I think this topic's excellent because, you know, programming is always the sort of Achilles heel for a lot of trainers, even experienced ones, right? Because it's not really taught, I'd say, even at a fundamental level, at least Cert 3 and 4. And in particular, looking at sort of how programming delivery is sort of different for athletes compared to general pops. But then general pops, we've then got special populations, if you like, or subgroups like children, older adults, etc. So, yeah, it's going to be fascinating. And let's have a deep dive now. So, Kim, over to you.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I guess Tarek said it right, that I would nerd out on this. This is a topic that I am super interested in and very passionate in when it comes to education. And I guess, yeah, what Tarek said is exactly right. Doing your Cert 3 and 4, I know the experience that I've had with students that have come out of it, and even doing it myself, you walk out feeling a little bit lost in terms of, like, what do I do now? I have this library of exercises. How do I put it together? How does it suit each person? You know, and what am I doing? It's kind of what you get out of it. So then I guess for me, I was really searching for that system and that answer. And I went to uni looking for that with exercise sports science. And to be honest, what I got out of that was great for elite athletes. But again, it didn't really cover general population. Like, what do you do with your average client who just wants to come in and get fit? And I think there's so much information and different options out there that it can get really overwhelming in how to program differently. And I think it results in a lot of people becoming quite stock standard with their programming. You know, you get into your own routine of, like, you progress this one to this one and this one, and you don't think outside the box all that much. So for me, I'm all about, you know, changing things up and progressing movements in different ways rather than your standard options. So Tarek, are you able to enable me to screen share, pretty please, if you can?
And then what I will say just to the participants is just throw some questions in that you may have around programming. We may not be able to answer everything on the spot, but there may be some overlap as well, common themes, challenges. So please throw that into the chat. All right, Kim, you've got sharing rights now.
Sweet. Yeah, please, by all means, guys, fire questions at me at any time. Give me your feedback, give me your thoughts. I'd love to make this as interactive as possible. So I've kept my slideshow game very simple because I'm not a slideshow person, but just so we have a little bit of direction here. So if we look at traditional training methods, you know, particularly just your traditional bodybuilding style training, using machines, all that kind of stuff, obviously the main focus is always on the sagittal plane, right? So you'll see everything is in that forward, backward, pick things up, put things down kind of traditional motion. So in doing that, we're kind of missing out on the other ways that we move our body. And if you think about traditional training methods as well, what often, you know, I guess, what are the most common movement patterns that we are utilizing within those training methods? So obviously we all cover a squat pattern, we'll cover a push, you know, being a bench press or a shoulder press, a pull and a hinge. Surprisingly, a lot of people will leave a lunge out. For me, I nerd out on lunges, so that, you know, but I think a lot of people avoid them because they're hard. And yeah, and that's it, right? So we might stick with the 5 kind of movement patterns in that way. And then traditionally as well, we progress your stock standard way to progress is to add more load. So increase your weight or add more volume. We can also, by increasing time under tension as well. So whether or not you do some pause reps or some slower paced reps, that seems to be the standard way that people look to program and progress their training. So, but what we want to do, I know for us, obviously being in these groups, we're all focused on functional training, at least to some degree. Is everybody here working with general population humans as well? Like chuck it in the chat for me if you have like special populations, or if you're working with athletes, or just yell out to me as well. Yeah, and we will see general pop for you, Alexander. Perfect. Yeah, cool. So when I did my Cert 3 and 4 and also my uni course, I kind of looked at these planes of motion and I went, why do I ever going to have to remember this? Like back in the day, it's like I would forget which one was which. It was quite a confusing thing to me. And now it's literally something I think about every day. So within these planes of motion, obviously we've talked about sagittal plane. So with that would be anything, our squat, our lunge, our lat pull down, our bicep curl, all of those things where we are literally just moving something up and down facing in that direction. So then if we consider frontal plane, that will be anything where you can see the movement when you're facing that person. So if you think like a lateral raise, a star jump, a side lunge, anything like that where you can see the movement when you're facing front onto that person. Then we also have the transverse plane, which is anything twisting, anything that involves rotation will bring you into that transverse plane. So I guess when we're thinking about programming, as I said, a lot of our movements come in to the sagittal plane. Like everything that we do that's kind of foundational is sagittal plane. But how do we actually move our bodies? And that's something as functional trainers, our goal is to improve movement mobility for people's everyday movement, right? But if we're thinking about people moving in the sagittal plane, they're literally going to be moving around like robots. So they're going to be going like straight forward to turn. It's this like full body shuffle, then straight forward. That's not really in reality how we move, right? So we reach to the side to pick things up. We rotate every time we put our seatbelt on, every time we get something out of the cupboard over our heads. Rotation and frontal plane movement are key movements in our everyday life. So I know I've come across quite a few people in the past who are very, very strong humans who can, deadlift 200 kilos, and then they bend over and pick up something off the floor, even a dog lead in one person's case. And because they've bent forward and twisted at the same time, they've actually strained a muscle in their glute doing that, right? So they can deadlift 200 kilos and they go to pick something up with rotation, boom, strained a muscle. It's pretty crazy. So, and I think everyone gets so caught up in that sagittal plane motion, they get so tight in that plane that adding that rotation in becomes, is where they come undone. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, does everyone who is in here now give me a sign in the chat? Do you incorporate frontal plane or transverse plane into your own training? Just hit me with a Y or an N if you want, so we can have a bit of a look. Nice, Alexander. Excellent. Look at this, guys. Tarek, feel free to chuck anything in if I've missed stuff as well.
It's good so far. I mean, one thing to consider, even in line with our 5 functional pillars, pillar 1 is to restore function. So we're working with Glenn Phipps on Stretch Yourself Strong. And so the idea is that even mobility and flexibility needs to follow this system, right? So even before we add in our strength and conditioning, our mobility and flexibility considerations need to follow these, not just your sagittal or your frontal transverse, but different derivations or degrees of flexibility, mobility are really important. And you use that great analogy, that example even of people who are very strong in sagittal, but they go and rotate and they don't have enough, rotation, for example, and then bang, they've blown a disc or pulled a muscle, what have you. So, yeah, that's an interesting concept I want everyone to consider here. And certainly in light of the progressions that we teach in the MFT and certainly MRC programs.
Yeah, for sure. And that's, 100% right, even within mobility. And I think you can always tell the people who are, haven't done all that much rotational or frontal plane work, even if you just do a mobility flow and in a group class and you hear that, when you move into a twist pattern, you're like, oof, that's a tight human over there, right? So working it in body weight is super, super important before you start loading in these positions if you're not used to doing that. But it's just, looking at ways we can start incorporating more of that with your clients. So out of the two, frontal and the transverse, is there any issues that you guys have programming more? Like, do you struggle more to incorporate frontal plane, or do you struggle more to incorporate transverse plane, one or the other? Let me know in the chat as well, and then we can try and direct a little bit more info if you want a little bit more that way. For me, I find frontal plane a little harder than transverse, just because I really am a little bit obsessed with rotational movement. So I always incorporated that into my sessions, but frontal can be a little bit more challenging. So if anyone has a preference over the other, getting a mix of both is a struggle, Amy? Yeah, for sure. For sure. So we're going to go through some progressions later that will hopefully help you, come up with a few more exercises in your repertoire. Will transverse always be core dominant? Yes and no. I think you're always definitely going to need a lot of core stability to produce a transverse movement, but I wouldn't say it would be dominant over the other patterns. Like if you put a rotation into your squat or your lunge, definitely it's going to activate core a lot more than your sagittal squat or lunge would, but the primary muscle movement still going to be through the legs in both those, if that makes sense. All right, so let's check this out. So Paul checks 7 primal movement patterns. So we talk a lot about this within our our MFT certification. And this is Paul checks classified the movements that we do as humans just in everyday life into 7 different patterns. So we've got a squat, a lunge, a bend, which we also know as a hinge, a twist, which we also know as a rotation, a pull, a push, and a gait. So a walk, a jog, a sprint. So within these, I mean, we do all of these every day, right? Like I think it's pretty common for us to do all of these movements. So as functional trainers, I personally think it's really, really important, speak words, Kim, to incorporate every single one of these movement patterns in some way, shape, or form into every training session I do, or every training program. You might not necessarily get each one of these into one session, but if you've got someone for 2 sessions a week, at bare minimum, I think you should be hitting every single one of these at least once in that week. Right. So, and there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. So is there any questions on that? I'm sure all of you guys have probably seen this before. You may also have seen the Great 8, which is a different type of classifying the movement patterns. Basically, I think that just divides up the pull and push into horizontal and vertical. And I don't know if it includes gait either. I can't remember. If anyone knows what the Great 8 incorporates, feel free to correct me or refresh my memory, but just a different way of classifying movement. So basically, whenever I write a program, and this is what makes things super easy if you're trying to create a program, is I want to incorporate all 7 movement patterns and all 3 planes of motion every single time. So this is literally my checklist in my head every time I go through. Right. So this will create a full body balanced program every single time. So let's say, you go through, you put a just a squat. You might have a regular lunge, a bent over row as your pull, a standard deadlift, a push up. So then I would go through and be like, okay, have I hit the sagittal plane? Yes, always yes. You'll always get that. Have I hit the frontal plane? If the answer is no, you might go, okay, well, how can I make a movement frontal? I might change my lunge from a normal sagittal lunge to a side lunge. Then if you look at, have I hit my rotation, then, or your transverse, then you could add a rotation into your movement. Let's say your push-up becomes a windmill push-up. So you're pushing up, rotating around to the side to get that rotation in. So generally speaking, if you create a program and then tick the 3 boxes of the planes of motion, you're going to have a good balance with your programming. If that doesn't make sense for anyone, then please let me know and we will we'll workshop that a little bit more. But yeah, that's my go-to checklist. And since I started using this, programming has become so much easier. Because, it's just there. It gives you a lot more variety as well, because it forces you to think outside the box. Thanks, Eddie. I know we've talked about this before in courses. Yeah, so let's move on. Oh, that's all I had. Where's my other slide? Anyway, okay. So if anyone has any questions on creating that program checklist, then great, let me know. Otherwise, I want to talk a little bit more about progressing movements. So as we said before, progressing movements is, the go-to is add more load, increase your time under tension, and by either slowing the timing of your reps or by doing more reps. But how else can we progress movement? We can definitely do it by changing our plane. So let's say a side lunge would be more challenging than a sagittal lunge, just in my opinion, or we could make it into a curtsy lunge. So that's going to be a progression in itself. Adding rotation is another way that you can progress movements as well. So, and these things are particularly important if you work in a setting where you have limited weight choices, because, there's only so many power bag weight, let's say you can go up to a 25 kilo functional bag. Well, what do you do if you're in a class, you don't have heavier functional bags and you have someone who is easily powering through that 25 kilo bag now? Well, you can add rotation to it, right? So by making a movement more complex, it's really important to remember that that's also a progression. We don't just have to do more reps. In terms of keeping clients engaged, I think that has also been a big game changer for me, thinking outside the square in, okay, well, how do we put these movements together? How do we add a frontal plane into this movement? You could add a lateral step, like a squat plus step. All those things can really change your program up and also progress the complexity of your exercises. So, Tarek, do you have anything to add on that?
You're spot on. I think, often a missing piece, you talked about volume and load, is complexity. It's something that's often an afterthought. It's quite interesting. Or, what happens is people skip the progressions within the planes itself. So going from sagittal, they might even just touch on that, and then they will get their clients rotating and doing frontal plane movements. So it's really important to follow that to really get strong in the sagittal first. And I think really heavy loaded explosive movements, i.e. with the barbell, require both a strong sagittal and frontal plane sort of situation, right? Because you've got the load, the angular momentum of a bar, for example. So you need to be very strong in that frontal plane. So it's just something to consider there that, sometimes people can get quite fancy with transverse and they look at, sort of videos or friends or, others who are doing these fancy movements, but it doesn't fit the client's needs. So always go to that sort of needs analysis. I always sort of harken back to that, whether it be mobility considerations, it's a needs analysis. And some people may have had, a traumatic injury or a essentially from birth, they've got a defect that doesn't allow them to do as much rotation, for example. So, you really got to understand the client's needs. And if you're working with NDIS or more higher risk clients, the MRC program really touches on going beyond just the 7 primal patterns and looking at all of the different vector forces involved and other considerations. So it's really important to look at, have that holistic picture. Probably the other thing I'd sort of consider there, Kim, is the lever load. So let's just say I've got my camera off because my internet's not good, but let me put that back on. So let's just say here I've got my kettlebell in a goblet position and it's hugged to the chest, and I do a lunge or a squat. What I can do is I can push that out just that little bit more, right? So I can bring that out 10, 20 centimeters. And what that does then is that shifts that lever load, then makes that movement a lot more difficult as well. And that could be said for rack is a rack. I would not sort of bring it out here. That's really dangerous on the shoulder. So I'm not going at that level. But if you've got a safe position and I'm going to bring that kettlebell forward, that is a classic way to change that lever length as well. So something to consider there as well. Keep going, Kim.
Yeah. No, for sure. And yeah, Tarek makes a really good point, right? As I said, adding these things in is a progression. So you do need to make sure that you're ready to progress that. And I think if you think about, let's say, I'll go back to the example I had before of using a 25 kilo power bag for a deadlift, and that's got to a point where that's just too easy for a particular person in your group class. Then I wouldn't necessarily go, hey, let's make this a transverse deadlift and add rotation, but keep them on the 25 bag. You might need to go back to the 15 kilo bag, because as we said, you're suddenly incorporating a lot more coordination and difficulty into that movement, right? So you definitely need to consider the challenge that you add by doing that. But in other cases, let's say you add a lateral step to your squat, like I mentioned before, that's adding some great coordination, but not necessarily adding any difficulty within the actual squat, right? The squat's still the same. At the top, you just take a step to the right. So yeah, definitely considering the weights and the ways that it's appropriate to progress a client. And I think, as Tarek said, it can be really easy. You get caught up on like Instagram, you see these really cool exercises and these really complex things. And they look great when the coordinated, very fit, very strong person on Instagram does them, but not all of your clients are ready to move like that. So you need to look at ways that you can really simply add and change your planes of motion around that are going to suit your person. Yep. So one
more thing, Kim, I was going to add, sort of base positions are very important. So oftentimes it's very, like you said earlier, like very squared, and by, essentially you've got hip width, and that's been sort of drummed in, I think, over the years, so 3 or 4. But if we want to narrow the stance, we'll go single leg, we'll go split stance. I think it's important to eventually vary those up, because that again is going to help with the vestibular system, balance, coordination considerations, or then crossing over into sport specific, right? So if you've got more of a split stance, an off stance, it's going to be more conducive to some elements of sport, even general pops, right? Because some people still like playing sports and doing recreational activities. So that was another thing I'd like to add in as well, is think about your base positions, but don't sort of jump to split stance or single leg right away because of the stability situation or lack of mobility as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think even, it's like being more stable with a split stance is not just relevant for people who are playing sport. It's just relevant for you walking around. Like, even if you're trying to reach up to get something out of a high cupboard on one foot, like you get up onto your tippy toes to try reach, like all of those kind of things. Like it's definitely really relevant for your everyday life. Like one of my favorite, I go through, I'm sure all of you guys, you go through phases of exercises you like putting in programs, and you just like use them heaps, and then you kind of forget about some, and then you're like, oh, I forgot about that. One of my favorites at the moment is just a banded standing single arm row, just, anchored to a pole, pulling back. And then the progression is to do it standing on one foot. So the row stays exactly the same, but suddenly they've got the instability because they've taken one foot off the floor, and it challenges the core and the row on a whole new level, right? So again, progression, by challenging the stability rather than making the band harder or progressing to a heavier weighted exercise.
Yeah, excellent example. Yeah.
Yeah. Does anyone have any examples they'd like to share, like their favorite ways to progress or change things up?
I think, Jeff, you mentioned needs and limitations. So is that in consideration to what programming progressions we provide? That's for certain. But if there's anything else you wanted to add to that, Jeff, please feel free, or anyone else.
Adding a BOSU. I love that, Kevin. So yeah, definitely a progression on the stability factor right there. Nice. We are putting out rotation. The videos of the week at the moment is all rotation series as well. So if you guys are looking for different ways you can incorporate rotation into your movements, we're releasing a new one each week. So last week was on deadlifts. This week's on swings. And we're going through all of the movement patterns. So stay tuned on those too if rotation is something that you can struggle to incorporate as well for some different ideas.
And definitely the needs analysis, like I mentioned earlier there, Jeff, you talked about client limitations. It needs to be factored in. And I think the hardest thing is really training the general pops. You know, I often talk to strength and conditioning coaches around this as well as athletes. You know, they're getting paid, they turn up to training, and they sort of just listen, right? Because there's a clear outcome for them. But for the general pops, right, you've got, it's not just general. There's going to be all of these considerations that come up based on an assessment and needs analysis. And like I said earlier, if you're working with sort of NDIS based sort of clients, you know, they're going to be more in need of even these stripped regressions, right? And a lot of MRC based activities. I think the other thing, Kim, you want to talk about is really the fun or variation element. You know, there's progressions, regressions, but also variations, and what your take is on adding elements of fun and variations to ensure that programming still stays on point, but also understanding personalities. And again, we can deep dive and probably another few sessions based on personality types. But what are your experiences and maybe some wisdom on variations and making it a little bit more enjoyable, you know, in terms of movement progressions?
Oh, yeah. And I think this is so important. This is where it comes into just actually really listening to your client and figuring out what makes them tick, right? So, I mean, I've got quite a lot of people who are like, I don't really like exercise. But when they come to you, they're like, no, thanks. I'm here because I have to be. This is not what I'm interested in. You've got to find what makes them tick, right? So for some of those people, finding exercises that mentally challenge them is absolutely key, right? So we've been working on their mobility to get them better with rotational movement, just body weight, being able to rotate, so that you can then challenge them with some more differently mentally stimulating, like flows, for instance, whether it be body weight, whether it be kettlebell, whether they nail a Turkish get up, because there's so many complex kind of steps in that it almost distracts them from the fact that they're moving, because they're so focused on the mental challenge of that as well. But then other people will come in the door and they're like, no, thank you. I do not like feeling uncode. Do not give me that stuff. And it's a way of, you know, you've got to incorporate everything and just keep it simple, get to the point, right? So, listening to your client and understanding the way that they're going to enjoy training is so important. Obviously, you've got to give them what they need, not always just what they want. But you've definitely got to prioritize their preference, because otherwise they'll just stop doing it, right? So, which can be really challenging. Like if you have people that are like, oh, I don't like this, I don't like that, it's a bit like, but eventually when you figure out how they tick, you know, you can set them some movement-based goals and suddenly they actually enjoy going to the gym. And that's a win, right? Because that means they're going to keep coming, they're going to be healthier, more mobile and stronger across the time.
Great point.
Yeah.
We're almost done, but I thought we'd just add to that a little further is that element of concentration. And I think these are the other considerations, the soft skills of coaching that we can dive into very deeply, but need to also be considered. So along preferences, how do you get clients to stay focused, to increase levels of concentration, get more into perhaps a flow state, become more mindful within that session? So are there any sort of hacks that you use? I mean, you talked about making like a Turkish get up, you might like use a water bottle, yeah, or a cup, right? Like we teach in the course, and the movement still is loaded, right? Because they're going from a lying position to a standing. But the use of this or a cup or anything novel, like I've got, for example, I bring this everywhere with me, these blocks, yoga blocks, balance that on the fist, and then you've got different degrees of making that more challenging, right, wherever that sort of sits. So I think you're spot on there, Kim, and that allows that level of focus to kind of be akin to getting into a flow state, and therefore mitigating risk of injury, but also empowering the client to be more aware and be more, take ownership, of their own body.
Yeah, for sure. And focusing on, by making things more, progressing movements by varying them. It really keeps people's mental focus there a lot more than just always like, just go heavier. If they're on week 8 of doing lunges, if they don't really enjoy that, they're like, oh, what am I going to have for dinner? Oh, I've got this important meeting tomorrow. The focus has gone out of the lunge. Whereas let's say you incorporate a rotation into that lunge, suddenly their brain's like, oh, where do I rotate? Okay, I'm doing this. It really like brings them back to that present moment in a lot of ways as well, I think.
Yeah, totally. No, brilliant. This is really good stuff. Are there any final thoughts, considerations, everyone who's stayed the course, which really, really brilliant. Now, Kim does provide the videos of the week, and there's often some great progressions within those series that are covered. So stay tuned for those. Again, can you remind the group what time on Fridays? I think it's Friday the live, yeah?
Wednesdays.
Wednesdays. There you go.
It's usually Wednesdays at 10 a.m. We've been going through some kettlebell swing technique tips on those at the moment. I missed today's because I'm here, but that's fine. So next week we'll be back into those. But no, the videos of the week we put out, it varies what day of the week. I like to surprise everybody. They go out on the public socials on Mondays, and then usually it's Monday or Thursday that they get put up onto the groups. But yeah, check out those variations, guys. And I have tried to incorporate variations that are both, really challenging, but also ones that you could incorporate for anybody. So they're not necessarily super, super difficult for a newer person to do, but they are still ways that you could incorporate a little bit of rotation into your movement without going overly extreme for a beginner.
Yes, exactly. No, that's terrific. And look, anyone who's within the FFC, Functional Fitness Concepts group, you can tag friends, share it with them, and especially if they're enthusiasts of movement or they're trainers, of course, that would be great if you could share the love. And find out more about what we do. If you haven't undertaken the MFT program, Master Functional Trainer, we deep dive into programming. But again, going back to the fundamentals, it's really important to really look at these patterns, planes of motion, and then work on complexity. But also understanding that each client is different, understand their needs, do a needs analysis. That's often missing, and I often teach that. It's so important. So thank you, Kim. We'll be doing more and more of these things. So there's plenty of content that we always put out there. So any final thoughts to the group?
And if there are areas that you struggle with within this as well, like feel free to reach out too. If you need a little bit of an inspiration in certain areas of this, hit me up. I would love to help you guys, whether it's in a group, if you're, feeling confident, or one-on-one, just flick me a message on Facebook through that group as well. If you're a little bit nervous to interact with the group, that's also fine. Happy to help you guys however you're feeling comfortable.
Terrific. Brilliant stuff, Kim. Thank you for all of those who stayed the course. This has been recorded, so we'll put this up in the groups as well. You're welcome, Gaynor, and everyone else. Have a great rest of the day.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.